this week's lecture on the Mysteries of Udolpho, written by Anne Radcliffe. In this concluding lecture on the novel, I'll be briefly discussing the concept of Gothic in relation to travel, and I'll also be talking about ideas of marriage in the context, in the 18th century context, and we'll be looking at two discussion questions related to this particular novel. Radcliffe, we need to remember, published romantic novels such as The Castles of Athlin and Dunbayne, published in 1789, and The Sicilian Romance 1790. It is for the publication of her third novel, The Romance of the Forest, published in 1791, which established her as a Gothic novelist. So I might want to point your attention to the fact that there is a close affinity between Romance and Gothic. The transition between the two literary domains seemed to happen seamlessly in the case of Radcliffe. And with Radcliffe's most successful release of The Mysteries of Udolpho, published in 1794, she proved her mastery of terror, the concept of terror, which won her the epithet the Great Enchantress of the Gothic movement. And this epithet, Great Enchantress, was coined by the English writer Thomas de Quincey. So you can see how she gradually migrates from writing romances to writing Gothic fiction, and the impact of romance, the idea of adventure, the great travels involved in romance, and the romance plot itself, the romance plot here referring to courtship plot, also being embedded in the Gothic narratives, make it easy for such a transition. Now, travel books, particularly descriptions of Italy, made an important contribution to Anne Radcliffe's evocation of the exotic past. So this is a crucial idea, the relationship between Gothic and travel and the idea of past. If you remember the previous lecture, we were talking about the idea of the primitive and the idea of pre-modern past, how the primitive seem to kind of indicate the pre-modern past of Great Britain. So an evocation of the exotic past of countries such as Italy seemed to kind of evoke the past of Great Britain itself. So that symbolic idea is made possible through this kind of exoticization of foreign countries. The evocation of the exotic past is also a typical characteristic of the Gothic novel. So it's an important motif, and we also should remember that the effect of the past on the present is also one of the discourse of the Gothic novel. Now, we have examples of this kind of relationship between the past and the present. For example, in The Castle of Otranto, Walpole claims that the plot is based on a manuscript which he kind of found in the library of an ancient Catholic family in the north of England. So you can see how that manuscript is being distanced in time, and also physically in the north of England. It's not in the south where we have the cities and where the financial centers are functioning. So you can see how distancing has its own ramifications in terms of the hermeneutics. So apparently this book was printed in Naples in the black letter in the year 1579. So not printed in Great Britain. So, and also not printed now in the contemporary time, but in the 16th century. So distancing physically and temporally has a particular significance in terms of the Gothic novel, and that seems to indicate both an exoticization on the part of the writer and also an evocation of the primitive past of Great Britain. Now, travel and Gothic fiction. Gothic fiction derives from travel writing not only a range of general descriptive strategies, such as the strategy of constructing dramatic oppositions between wild and cultivated scenes of nature, but also a large number of precise descriptions of particular spots and of particular varieties of natural scenery. So you can see how narratives about travel have an impact on the structure of Gothic fiction. Travel narratives are useful. They're useful to Gothic fiction because these narratives help Gothic fiction make a differentiation between the wild scenery and the cultivated scenes. There is, of course, a big difference between a garden and wild undergrowth that you can find, surrounding rundown Gothic castle. So there is a distinction being made between the two, and the language of this differentiation between the types of scenery can be drawn from travel narratives by the Gothic writers. And this travel narrative also offers Gothic writers, a range of interesting scenery which can be used in particular novels. Descriptions about Italy can be made use of in several Gothic fiction, say for example in Castle of Otranto and other fiction of the kind. So these are important narratives for Gothic novels. Now, the connection between the landscapes in Gothic novels and travel journals suggests that Gothic novels are a form of armchair tourism. By reading Radcliffe's scenic descriptions, which are both influenced by landscape paintings and travel journals, the reader does not have to leave his or her chair in order to travel through beautiful landscapes. The reader is once more put into the position of the observer. So, this critical comment lays bare one of the immediate benefits to a reader of reading Gothic fiction. So, in addition to being scared by the novels, the reader can also kind of metaphorically visit all these places that are described, which are part of the narrative of Gothic fiction. So there is a kind of an armchair tourism going on the pages of Gothic fiction, an armchair tourism enjoyed by the reader. So this critic also points out that Radcliffe's scenic descriptions are influenced not only by travel journals but also painting. So, and the reader does get to enjoy all these descriptions, which are painted by words by Anne Radcliffe. So, we also get the sense that the reader is once more in the position of a viewer of a scenery. So it can be a painting of a particular scene in Naples, in Italy, in Geneva. So you can see one of the immediate benefits of this kind of armchair tourism. There's one other point that I want to kind of bring up in a symbolic manner, which relates to the idea of how this set of travel narratives makes a distinction between the wild and the cultured, wild and the kind of tamed nature. So the difference between the wild bushes and the really neatly pruned garden. So there is a kind of a connection that we can make with the different kinds of domesticities or the different kinds of characters. On the one hand, we have all these counts who are evil in Gothic fiction. On the other, we have British characters, British women, British females, heroines who are good and who are brought up in probably more, genial, ideal situations. So there is a difference being made here between the good and the bad by pointing symbolically to the wild nature and the cultivated nature. So the English countryside is supposed to be ideal, and the strange exotic places, which are found in foreign spots are, symbolically evil. So that kind of distinction is also being brought out through this travel narrative, which are used in travel narratives, which are used in Gothic fiction. And it's also very interesting to note that Radcliffe had not traveled outside of England at the time she wrote the Mysteries of Udolpho, and many of her descriptions of the beautiful landscapes of France and the romantic splendors of Italy were borrowed from travel books. So you can see that Radcliffe had not traveled outside of the country when she wrote this fantastic Gothic fiction, but yet we have vivid descriptions of the countryside of the foreign countries, and that really tells you the impact of all these travel books and illustrated editions of paintings and other visual material have had on this kind of Gothic work. Now, let's turn our attention to the Gothic heroine. I want to kind of bring your attention to this conversation between Emily, the heroine of the Mysteries of Udolpho, and Count Montoni, who is the villain of the piece. And Emily says, with a lot of dignity, "You may find, perhaps, Signor," said Emily with mild dignity, "that the strength of my mind is equal to the justice of my cause, and that I can endure with fortitude when it is in resistance of oppression." "You speak like a heroine," said Montoni contemptuously. "We shall see whether you can suffer like one." So Emily's words are particularly interesting because she talks about fortitude, courage. She talks about resistance. She makes a reference to oppression. She talks about justice, and she says that if I'm being treated unjustly, I'll rise to the occasion and I'll face the situation courageously, with fortitude. And those terms, the terms of justice, fortitude, makes Montoni react and state that you speak like a heroine. It's a heroine who has all these attributes of courage and resistance, and not just a heroine. Male heroes also have this kind of set of attributes. So you can once again think back to the idea of heroinism, which we find used in reference to the idea of female Gothic, and we also know that heroinism talks about the growth trajectory of the heroine, just as the growth trajectory of the hero is sketched in a Bildungsroman. And you can also see the very evil side of Montoni when he says that I'll make you suffer like a heroine, the central female character in a piece of work. So there is a kind of a self-consciousness, a meta-narrative kind of feel going on here too. The Gothic heroine is somebody who is in the category, a category which embodies or talks about the new order of liberty and enlightenment, and that happens in the case of the Mysteries of Udolpho's heroine, Saint Emily St. Aubert, because she has anachronistically, she has fashionable sensibility, manners, and taste of the 18th century England. So you can see how she doesn't seem to belong to her age, but she seems to kind of belong to a different age, which we kind of discussed in the previous lectures. The point is to create an ambience rather than to kind of reproduce the actual time and age. The point of the novel is to kind of create this idea of ancient quality to the novel, to talk about oppression, which is reflected in the character of Count Montoni. Now, let's quickly take a look at the status of married women in the 18th century. Married women found it very difficult to control any of their own property during marriage, while a husband could not take away his wife's land or other real property. He could take all the rents and other income these properties generated. So these ideas tell you the kind of control that the husband had on the female. So even though he could not really kind of snatch away the property, the proceeds from the property, the income from the property could be taken away by the husband. By law, husbands had the right to physically punish their wives, and women had little recourse to escape bad marriages. So punishment is something which can be given to the wife by the husband. And if you remember the Mysteries of Udolpho, Count Montoni kind of punishes the wife by imprisoning her in the castle when she refuses to give up her property. Divorce by act of parliament was enormously expensive and quite rare. And in fact, from 1670 to 1857, only 4 women managed to obtain divorces this way. So you can see how very difficult it is to escape a very bad and unhappy and abusive marriage in those days. And that was probably one of the release for the spouses. when Anne Radcliffe signed the publishing contracts for the Mysteries of Udolpho and her other novels, her husband William Radcliffe had to sign them as well. A contract signed by a wife without her husband's consent had no legal validity, and a woman had no right to sell property, intellectual or otherwise. So this fantastic point really gives you a very good picture of the status of women in those times. In fact, the author Anne Radcliffe, when she had to sign the contracts, her husband had to sign them as well, because only then the contract became valid, because the wife had no right to sell any kind of property, be it creative, intellectual or any other kind. Now, I have a couple of discussion questions here. Some of the questions that you might think about when you're ruminating on this novel is something like this. Considering Montoni, what do you make of the trend in English literature to use Italians as mysterious, malevolent villains? Why does English literature make use of Italians as villains? That's a good question to think about. You'll remember that this device was also later used by Wilkie Collins in his Woman in White. Why do you think so many English authors turn to Italy for their villains? So why this foreign villain? Why this particular nation's villain in many of English fiction in those period? In that period is a good starting point to talk about issues of othering and how problematic issues are kind of transported to a different place, to different figures, in order to kind of resolve them. How do you find Radcliffe's narrative style? Do you find it effective? She keeps a lot of things mysterious and doesn't reveal very much at all, leaving the reader and Emily to freak out more about the unknown than necessarily any proven evil occurring in the story. So this question asks you to think about the idea of foreshadowing, the fears that the women have in the story. Is this a good strategy, or do you think there is a different way in which Anne Radcliffe could have kept the reader hooked instead of kind of making it this kind of eerie? So these are some of the questions you can think about in relation to the narrative style of the Mysteries of Udolpho. So in conclusion, what do we make of this novel? So the supernatural aspects of Udolpho now seem a little outmoded. Radcliffe's central concern with female rights and male power has lost none of its relevance. So if you have read the novel and if you think that the Gothic feels a bit outdated, it doesn't scare you, or if it's not really interesting, but you can think about the central concern of the novel, which is about female rights, the assertion of the individual will, especially Emily St. Aubert's, her fight against the oppression of Count Montoni, who symbolizes male power. These concerns have lost none of its relevance or its potency. Located within the genre of female Gothic, written largely and read largely by women, Radcliffe's novels explore issues of patriarchal control, women's property rights, and the underlying threat of sexual violence, whether through forced marriage or rape. So this novel kind of discusses a lot of very, very interesting and significant subject matters, such as patriarchy, the idea of property rights for women, and the violence, the underlying sexual violence inflicted on women in various forms on the pages of the novel. So these are some of the issues which make this novel very, very relevant even to this day. Thank you for watching. I'll continue the next session.